Look at her.
What's going on?
The moment my daughter-in-law, Melissa, demanded the keys to my apartment to house the wedding staff, she believed she was publicly humiliating a helpless old man. She didn't know that for every word she uttered in front of those 150 guests, she would ultimately pay $3 million. My name is Richard, and at 68, I had spent the last 5 years perfecting the role of the financially dependent, slightly clueless father. This facade was strictly for Melissa. She was a gold digger, a creature obsessed with wealth and status, who could only tolerate the unsuccessful if she could dominate them. By pretending to be down on my luck, living off a tiny pension, I allowed her true mercenary nature to surface. The goal was to prove, on the grandest stage possible, that she saw me not as family, but as a pitiful obstacle to be removed before she seized full control of the family trust. If you appreciate stories of quiet patience leading to perfect revenge, and you don't want to miss how the rest of this drama unfolds, please consider hitting that subscribe button now. We were at her wedding, a spectacle that was lavishly financed by the very generational wealth she was ravenous for. The venue was a historic estate. The budget was obscene. She moved through the room like a temporary queen, her smile professionally sweet, but her eyes cold and calculating. She wasn't marrying my son David for love. She was marrying him for the trust that was scheduled to become fully accessible in just 6 months. The first subtle jab came during the cocktail hour. Melissa cornered me near the bar. "Richard, darling, I know you drove yourself here, but we urgently need your parking spot. It's too close to the main entrance for guests." I raised an eyebrow, playing the apologetic fool. "My spot? But I just parked right up front, dear. I thought it was convenient." She leaned in, dropping the pretense. "It's not convenient, Richard. It looks cheap. This is a $500,000 event. We need the luxury cars up front, not your 20-year-old sedan. Be a dear and move it to the back lot, where the vendor vehicles are." David agrees. It's about the presentation. I immediately agreed, feigning embarrassment. "Of course, Melissa. My deepest apologies. I'll go move it right now." I drove the old car to the dusty back lot, allowing her to savor that minor victory. This was about establishing the pecking order. Every small act of subservience cemented her belief that I was powerless. What she didn't know was that while I was moving that sedan, I was also sending a quick, encrypted text. It wasn't about the car. It was to alert my highly paid legal team that the first public act of dominance and unwarranted demand had been recorded. The trap was set, and she was happily running toward the bait. I returned to the ballroom, ready for the next act of the performance, knowing the final curtain call was close. I took my seat again, settling into the cheap polyester suit I'd bought years ago, specifically to look the part of the struggling elder. I needed to look like a man who couldn't afford to fight back. Melissa barely glanced at me. She was busy organizing the seating charts, her voice sharp and commanding toward the venue staff. She and David believed they were celebrating their impending total financial freedom. David would inherit the trust his grandfather set up in 6 months, and Melissa saw herself as the true manager of that money. What they failed to understand was that the trust was not a simple savings account. It was a complex entity with one absolute authority: me. You see, I am not just Richard, the supposedly cash-strapped retiree. I am Richard, the executive trustee and sole director of the Blackwood Family Trust, a position I quietly and legally assumed after my father passed away. I controlled every dime that was paying for the champagne, the 5-course dinner, and Melissa's designer wedding gown. I was the puppet master, funding the very stage on which I was about to be humiliated. But the real power lay in a different document. Melissa's own inheritance trust, set up by her wealthy but incredibly traditional and stern grandfather. That trust was worth roughly $3 million. Melissa had always bragged about its value, believing it was untouchable. However, her grandfather, a man who valued honor above all, had included a critical and rarely used amendment, the Fiduciary Conduct Clause. This clause stipulated that any direct, documented, public act of coercion, fraud, or intentional financial exploitation directed toward any member of the family's senior management, that is, the current executive trustee, which was me, would trigger an immediate review by an independent auditor. If the auditor confirmed a breach of public integrity and good faith, the trust could be instantly frozen and potentially redirected. I had spent months preparing the legal foundation for this night. I wasn't just hoping she would slip up, I was baiting her. The parking incident was my initial signal to the legal team, a confirmation that she was already acting with unwarranted dominance. I needed her to do something public, egregious, and undeniable, something that showed her true predatory nature to a room full of witnesses. Her demand for my apartment keys, which I knew was coming, was the perfect storm. It was a direct demand for my personal property, based purely on her perceived financial superiority and desire to control every aspect of the wedding. I watched her toast David, laughing, radiating arrogance. She was so close to having everything she wanted, and the tension was mounting because the longer she waited, the closer she got to triggering the clause that would leave her with absolutely nothing. I checked my phone discreetly. The independent auditor was on standby, ready for my final activation code. The silence before the storm was delicious. The dinner service began, a lavish affair with silver-domed plates and waiters in crisp white gloves. Melissa was strategically seated next to a key investor from David's firm, the kind of person she desperately needed to impress for their future business prospects. This high-stakes setting only amplified her need to perform and control. I was relegated to table 12, the furthest from the head table, reserved for extended, less relevant relatives. This was her subtle way of minimizing my presence, another deliberate act of social demotion designed to keep me out of sight and out of mind, confirming her power over the situation. During the soup course, she began her routine using the wireless microphone, ostensibly to thank the guests, but really to command attention. She deliberately turned her focus to my table. And I want to give a special shout-out to David's father, Richard, who has been absolutely wonderful in letting us take over his life these last few months, she said, her voice dripping with the fakest sincerity. The comment drew polite but confused chuckles from the surrounding tables. She continued, escalating the insult with calculated sweetness. We all know Richard is on a fixed income, bless his heart, and he's been so flexible. We had to store a few of the extra floral arrangements in his garage, which, blessedly, he doesn't use for much else besides junk. He's such a helpful, simple man, and we truly appreciate his availability. The word simple was delivered with a cruel, condescending pause. It wasn't simple as in kind. It was simple as in intellectually and socially inferior. The entire table fell quiet. David squirmed slightly, looking down at his plate, but he said nothing, a clear, weak sign of his complicity in her contempt. I simply smiled and raised my glass to her, playing the role of the humble, slightly deaf old man who hadn't quite grasped the subtle cruelty of her words. Inside, I was ticking off the legal boxes. Public disparagement? Check. Intentional emotional pressure? Check. Later, a waiter accidentally placed a large floral centerpiece near the edge of her table. Melissa noticed, paused her conversation with the investor, and without breaking eye contact with him, snapped her fingers in my direction. Yes, she snapped her fingers. "Richard, excuse me," she called across the room, loud enough for table 12 to hear. "Could you do me a favor? This flower arrangement is blocking Mr. Henderson's view. It's too heavy for the young staff. Could you please come and help me move it over to the side console? I know you could use the stretch." I rose slowly, deliberately, giving her plenty of time to revel in her authority. I walked across the vast ballroom, a man in a cheap suit, moving a heavy centerpiece under the direct orders of the bride. Every guest watched the ridiculous spectacle. The bride commanding her father-in-law around like a hired hand. The investor looked genuinely uncomfortable by the display of disrespect. As I placed the vase down, she looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated triumph, a look that plainly stated, "You are nothing to me, and you will obey." I met her eyes, held the smile, and thought, "Enjoy this moment, Melissa. It is the most power you will ever hold." I knew the next scene, the one I had patiently planned for, would be the most critical, the final piece of evidence I needed. The formal speeches were underway, a brief, merciful distraction from Melissa's aggressive performance. But the respite was short-lived. Following the best man's humorous, obligatory speech, Melissa grabbed the microphone once more, tapping it with a dramatic flourish. Every eye in the ballroom turned to her. She didn't stay safely at the head table. She theatrically walked the entire length of the ballroom, weaving past tables laden with crystal and expensive flowers, until she stood directly beside my insignificant table 12. She pointed the microphone right at me. "Now," she announced, her voice cutting through the elegant quiet, "I have one final, crucial logistics issue to solve before the dancing begins. A major problem, really, but one that Richard, bless his generous soul, will graciously fix for us." She looked down at me, and her eyes held zero humor, only sharp, demanding authority. "Richard, dear," she called out, her voice carrying easily over the speakers to every one of the 150 uncomfortable guests. "I need you to hand over the keys to your apartment, immediately." A wave of astonished murmuring swept through the room. This was no longer subtle contempt. This was a naked, public shaming. "We had a major crisis with the florist's delivery," she continued, fabricating a ridiculous lie. "They've brought in a ridiculous amount of excess supplies. David and I have decided that your small place is, well, perfect for storing all the overflow equipment, and maybe for housing the cleaning crew overnight. You know, to keep them close to the venue." Her meaning was brutally clear. Your home is only fit for temporary storage and minimum wage workers. It was a vicious, calculated blow to my dignity. "Frankly," she added, adjusting her diamond necklace with a dismissive gesture, "the thought of your old furniture sitting empty while our staff needs accommodation is simply bad management. Hand them over, Richard. The planner needs them now. You can figure out where you're staying later. Just be cooperative for once." My son David half stood at the head table, looking pale and conflicted. He opened his mouth to speak, but Melissa silenced him with a tiny, imperious shake of her head. He sank back into his chair, confirming his full complicity. I reached into the pocket of my cheap suit. My hand trembled slightly, but not from fear, from the intense, contained excitement of the hunter who has finally sprung his trap. I was witnessing the final, undeniable proof I needed. I slowly pulled out the single key to my apartment and placed it on the crisp white linen of my tablecloth. I pushed it toward her. "Of course, Melissa," I said, my voice quiet, even submissive. but loud enough for the microphone to catch. Anything for the beautiful bride. She snatched the key up, gave me a look of satisfied contempt, and dramatically pivoted back toward her table. The public humiliation was complete. I let out a slow, controlled breath. The trap was now fully armed and locked. It was time for the counterattack. The silence she left behind was louder than any music. Melissa walked away, clutching my single house key like a trophy. She had won the public battle for my apartment, but she had just handed me the legal ammunition for the war. The humiliation was finished. Now came the reckoning. The guests reacted in various ways. Some looked away, embarrassed for me. Others whispered, clearly confirming the rumor that I was indeed the poor, helpless father. David didn't even look up. His shame was palpable, yet he prioritized his lavish wedding and his wife's approval over my dignity. I knew he was weak, but seeing him choose Melissa's cruelty over his own father hurt more than the public spectacle itself. I sat there for a moment, letting the mask of passive defeat settle firmly back onto my face. I needed everyone to believe I was truly crushed, but inside, I felt a calm, cold resolve. This wasn't anger. This was satisfaction. She had delivered the public, documented proof I needed. I excused myself from the table, announcing in a quiet voice that I needed a breath of fresh air. I didn't head for the main entrance. I headed for a small, unused study off the back corridor, a place I had scouted earlier. Once inside the quiet, darkened room, the cheap suit felt less like a costume and more like armor. I pulled out the burner phone I carried only for legal matters. There was no emotion in my movements. This was business. I opened a pre-written, encrypted message. It contained no names, no details of the wedding. It contained only one word, a prearranged legal code. Breach. This single word, coupled with the time-stamped surveillance footage from the venue, which I had secretly arranged to have running from the outset, was the independent auditor's confirmation. It was the signal that the fiduciary conduct clause in Melissa's $3 million trust had been definitively violated. The public demand for my property, the humiliation, the son's lack of intervention, it was all the required proof that her actions demonstrated gross misconduct and financial coercion against the trust's executive director. I pressed send. The message was delivered instantly to my lawyer, Mr. Stern, who was acting as the independent auditor. His immediate, prearranged action was to legally petition Melissa's trust management to initiate a temporary asset freeze and review. I checked the time. Mr. Stern was instructed to wait. Exactly 20 minutes after receiving the breach code, before making the crucial call to Melissa's own personal attorney. 20 minutes. That was all the time she had left to savor her victory. I put the phone away and took another deep breath. The revenge wasn't loud or violent. It was quiet, procedural, and irreversible. I returned to the ballroom, ready to deliver my perfect, devastatingly polite toast. The toast was met with a polite, slightly confused applause. The guests weren't sure what to make of my serious tone, which sounded less like typical wedding sentiment and more like a shareholder meeting address. Melissa, however, was clearly annoyed. She had wanted a display of adoration, not a lecture on integrity. She lifted her glass quickly, not meeting my eye, eager for the moment to pass so she could reclaim the spotlight. She thought my passive-aggressive wisdom was the full extent of my feeble retaliation. As I finished the toast and everyone settled back, I placed my champagne flute on the table. The legal clock I had set earlier was still ticking, but I had one final, crucial signal to send to Mr. Stern, my legal auditor. I turned slightly to the gentleman seated next to me, a man I barely knew, and engaged him in a completely fake conversation about the vintage of the wine. While keeping my eyes on him, making sure my body language looked casual, my right hand was concealed below the table. I quickly opened the pre-composed text message on the burner phone. The message wasn't another code word. It was a single, simple confirmation to my lawyer. Proceed with the call. This was the double check, ensuring that the legal action would be launched exactly at the predetermined time. I wanted the devastating news to hit Melissa while she was at her absolute peak of self-satisfaction. I slid the phone back into my pocket just as the DJ dropped the first aggressive dance track. The lights dimmed, the mirror ball spun, and the atmosphere instantly shifted from stiff formality to high-energy party. Melissa, relieved the awkward moment was over, dragged David onto the dance floor. She was laughing, twirling in her expensive dress, completely absorbed in her triumph. This was the final stage of my observation. I watched her dance, noting the total lack of conscience or regret in her expression. She had publicly stripped me of my home, the last symbol of my independence, and she was celebrating it. She looked genuinely ecstatic, oblivious to the irreversible financial disaster I had just triggered. The tension in the air was invisible to everyone but me. I felt the minutes dragging, each one bringing her closer to the seismic shockwave. David was trying to keep up with her on the dance floor, but even through the pulsing lights, I could see the slight strain and unease on his face. He was clearly uncomfortable with the keys incident, but his silence had cemented his fate alongside hers. I glanced at my watch again. 2 more
minutes. The noise, the lights, the celebratory madness, it was the perfect camouflage. No one would notice the subtle moment when a powerful man's life was about to be obliterated by a quiet, 5-second phone call. The music was a distraction, and Melissa, oblivious in the center of the dance floor, was about to receive the shock of her life. The dance floor was a controlled chaos of flashing lights and loud music, the perfect cover for my quiet internal war. I remained seated at table 12, observing the spectacle. I needed to appear relaxed, perhaps a little tired and defeated, just as an old man who had just been publicly stripped of his last asset should look. My eyes, however, were fixed on Melissa. She was the star of the show, pulling David through the crowd, demanding attention from every corner of the room. She was practically vibrating with victory. I knew they were planning to use the proceeds from her trust, once it was fully accessible, to put a hefty down payment on a sprawling mansion, which she already referred to as our new family estate. They had even secured a bridging loan based on the guaranteed future liquidity of her inheritance. She was so smug, so oblivious. She believed my silence and compliance meant I was broken. She thought her path to ultimate wealth was clear. This denial, this absolute certainty of success, was the most devastating ingredient in my revenge. The higher she soared in her arrogance, the harder her eventual fall would be. I casually checked my watch again. 1 minute remained. I watched David catch her eye as they danced. He mouthed something to her, maybe an apology for her having to deal with his troublesome father, or perhaps a reassurance of their future together. She smiled back, a dazzling, self-satisfied smile that promised him the world, a world she was about to irrevocably lose. I took a sip of water. My mouth was dry, not from nervousness, but from the immense mental focus required to maintain this charade. I imagined the scene happening miles away. Mr. Stern,
my legal counsel, looking at his own watch, lifting the receiver, and dialing the number of Melissa's attorney. I imagined the cold, procedural tone of that conversation, legally activating the breach clause, citing my public humiliation as the irrefutable evidence. The music volume seemed to increase, pounding against the walls. Melissa threw her head back, laughing, a loud, joyful sound of complete and total self-absorption. Ding! My pocket vibrated. It wasn't the burner phone. It was my main phone. A message from Mr. Stern's paralegal. Call initiated. The clock had struck. The financial weapon had been fired. Now I just needed to wait for the projectile to find its target. I smiled faintly, a real, genuine smile this time, hidden in the shadows of table 12. Melissa's phone, which she had carelessly left on the edge of the head table, began to glow fiercely, demanding her attention. The climax was moments away. The loud music and flashing lights were still dominating the room, yet my attention was solely on the head table. Melissa's phone, which had been glowing, suddenly began to scream, not a ringtone, but the harsh, insistent vibration of an incoming call, set to maximum urgency. It demanded immediate attention. Melissa was still dancing with David, laughing, completely immersed in her triumphant bubble. David noticed the phone first. He nudged her and pointed. She glanced over, annoyance flickering across her face. Who would dare interrupt her spotlight moment? She excused herself from David with a quick wave and stalked back to the head table. The call display showed Mr. Dean, urgent. Mr. Dean was her personal wealth attorney, the man who managed her $3 million inheritance trust. Her annoyance vanished, replaced by a flash of mild concern. Mr. Dean never called on weekends, let alone during her wedding. She hurried to a less crowded corner near the entrance to take the call. David followed her, his brow furrowed with curiosity and worry. I watched them both from my secluded table 12. Melissa put the phone to her ear, adopting the confident, commanding tone she reserved for professionals. "Hello, Mr. Dean. This is a bit inconvenient, but what is it?" I could only hear her side of the conversation, but her reaction was a spectacular, silent spectacle. Her face, moments ago radiating bridal beauty, instantly went slack. She froze mid-sentence, clutching the phone tightly. "Wait, frozen? What do you mean frozen? You can't legally do that, Mr. Dean. This is my trust." Her voice, initially hushed, began to rise, cracking with panic. She listened for a long, agonizing moment. I saw her look wildly around the room, and for the first time all night, her eyes desperately sought mine. She spotted me sitting alone, watching her with a calm, almost serene expression. The realization of what was happening was dawning on her. The fiduciary conduct clause? But based on what? It's completely fabricated. I was just asking for a place for the staff. What auditor? Who authorized this review? Mr. Dean's response must have been a calm, procedural explanation, citing the evidence and the authority. No, you don't understand. Our loan for the house, the bridging loan, is based on the liquidity. If it's frozen, we lose everything. David, tell him it was just a joke. She was practically shouting now, tears welling up and smearing her flawless makeup. David rushed to her side, grabbing her arm. He could clearly hear his father's name and fiduciary and frozen being screamed into the phone. He looked from her horrified face to my composed one. The absolute, terrifying truth hit David like a physical blow. He finally understood. The helpless old man he had silently betrayed was the one with the ultimate, irreversible power. I hadn't just been playing the victim, I was the judge and executioner. Melissa dropped the phone, clutching her head, sobbing uncontrollably as her $3 million future evaporated into the noise of the wedding reception.
I didn't need to hear the rest of Melissa's hysterical breakdown. Her wailing near the bathroom entrance, her desperate attempts to salvage her financial life, that was the crescendo of my revenge. David stood next to her, pale and utterly useless, finally seeing the monstrous mistake he had married and the true, quiet power of the father he had discarded. I stood up from table 12. No one noticed me immediately. All eyes were on the disaster unfolding near the exit. I walked slowly, calmly, toward the door, leaving the opulent, borrowed chaos behind. As I exited the ballroom and into the cool night air, I pulled out my own keys, the real keys, to my perfectly fine, mortgage-free apartment that Melissa had wanted for the cleaning crew. I had achieved more than just revenge. I had achieved peace. I had neutralized a parasitic force that would have eventually ruined David's life, even if he couldn't see it yet. My action protected my assets, and indirectly protected the remainder of the family fortune from her grasping hands. The decision to let her publicly humiliate me was the hardest part. It required me to endure contempt and shame in front of my peers. But true strength is knowing when to absorb a blow for the final, decisive strike. I realized then that my retirement was over. I wasn't going back to being the quiet, simple man. The next few months were a blur of legal restructuring. I moved forward with my life, focused on genuine growth. I started volunteering, consulting for a non-profit, using the sharp financial acumen I had kept hidden for years. I sold the old sedan and bought myself the classic car I always wanted, not for status, but for joy. I am truly happy, pursuing passions that Melissa would have deemed unprofitable. I am 68, and my life has just begun. I haven't heard from Melissa, and David and I are taking slow steps toward rebuilding our relationship, one conversation at a time, based on honesty this time. Now, I turn to you, the listener. I allowed myself to be publicly shamed, to be called simple and useless, so I could gather the undeniable evidence needed to dismantle a $3 million financial fortress. Did I do the right thing? What would you have done in my place? If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes revenge and hidden power, please show your support. Like this video to help other revenge seekers find this story. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and most importantly, subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming true revenge stories and dramatic tales. The end. Thank you for listening.